Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us on this sunny day. I'm going to introduce myself first and invite the panel, who I'm very excited about, to introduce themselves. My name is Tracy Abbott. I work for Microlink. We do workplace adjustments. We partner with our next panelist very heavily on doing assessments and the like for people who are neurodivergent or are neurodiverse. We've just been talking about language prior to coming live. Some housekeeping. This is being recorded. We will send out the recording to everybody who's registered to come on the session, whether they are able to attend or not. There is a closed caption option within Zoom at the bottom of your screen with the 3 dots where it says more. So if you need closed captioning, please put that on. If you've got any questions, please put it in the chat and we'll try and get back to as many as we can. But we've got quite a lot to crack on through. So just so you know, I'm very tall, Amazonian built, very long red hair, big red loud lipstick, which suits my personality. So if I can pass across to Nancy.
Hi, nice to see everybody. I'm Nancy. I'm a middle-aged woman with brown hair and glasses, white woman sitting in front of a really cool background that I can't take credit for myself, which is giving the title of my new book, Learning from Neurodivergent Leaders, in case anybody wanted to have a search for that.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for coming. Almuth.
So I'm Almuth, I'm a native German, and just for info, apparently my name in Old High German means pure of character, which is so true of me.
Wonderful.
I know. I'm standing here in a bright pink cardigan. I've got brown hair. I wear glasses. Without them, I can't see very much. And I leave glasses behind me wherever I go. And in the back of the room, I've got a drawing of the Rolling Stones in memory of my dear friend Martin, and 3 coaching books. One of them I co-authored with Nancy on neurodiversity coaching, and 2 of them have got chapters in them on neurodiversity coaching, which you might have guessed by now is a field that we feel very, very passionate about.
Wonderful. Loving this. Ruhel.
Thanks, Tracy. Hi, everyone. My name is Ruhel Ahmed. I'm slightly sort of on the opposite side, where I'm a South Asian, British Bangladeshi, and shorter sort of man. And I am currently in a room which is not as exciting as Alma's background, but I'm in a room where the AC isn't working, and it is starting to get slightly hot in here. But yeah, I'm an ACAS policy advisor. I work in the Inclusive Workplaces policy team, and sort of I led recently on our neurodiversity and reasonable adjustments campaign.
What a great line of people we have here today with masses of experience. The wonderful thing about these particular individuals that we've brought together for your edification and learning is that they all have really strong backgrounds within this subject. They've all got resources that they've very kindly shared with us that we will be sharing with you. And Alma mentioned a couple of books that she's been involved in. The same with Nancy. We recommend that you go online and buy them. So I wanted to start with kind of a gentle journey through the life of somebody who needs adjustments made, who may or may not be aware that they've been diagnosed with a neurodiverse condition, and how they're going to apply going through the work process. So when they're a candidate, through to when they're on board, and then when they actually start working with you. And we're going to finish up talking a little bit about what happens against the expectations and the productivity of the individual and the kind of adjustments you need to make along the way. So please, if you've got any questions, if you want to know any more about a particular topic, do stick your hand up in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will include you in the conversation. So if we can start, I mean, I wanted to understand, Alma, why candidates that are coming through, what's the psychology of whether or not they're going to tell you? Why does a company need to know that? Why are they going to tell you?
So could I reframe the question slightly?
Please, yes.
You know, does the company actually need to know and under what circumstances, because
Yeah.
it's the reality that roughly 1 in 5 of adult working population are going to be neurodivergent when you put all of the conditions together. And if you count in mental health conditions such as obsessive compulsive disorder, that figure might be slightly higher still. So wouldn't you think it might make logical sense for any employer, right, to expect that 1 in 5 people is going to be neurodivergent? And actually, can I do a quick plug for our ACAS research? That is one of the key things that has come out of that research, that we have to shift towards a preventative perspective where we expect this is going to happen, rather than a remedial perspective where we design all of our employment processes not expecting it, and then, oh, this doesn't work for everybody, and then make the adjustments
Yes,
afterwards, you see.
exactly.
So it's much better to think about neuroinclusion as prevention rather than cure after the fact, because the reality that 1 in 5 is going to be neurodivergent is not going to change. If anything, as you will have seen, every time you pick up your online newspaper, right, there's another discussion about rising rates of ADHD and so on and so forth. So let's move towards a prevention rather than cure. Some people might want to disclose during, let's say, a selection process, employment process. We know, though, from disability research, sadly, this is still a risky thing to do, because once you declare yourself, I see Nancy nodding, as different, people start judging you. So suddenly it's not, Almuth leaves her glasses behind because she's having a bit of a bad day. No, Almuth is always forgetful because she is. So you get attributed a label, and stigma and prejudice sets in. So the only way to counteract that is through a really, really positive organizational culture. We've got some lovely examples in our research, organizations getting it right, where actually they've totally destigmatized that process. They have decoupled it from a diagnosis, because not everybody, right? Diagnosis is immaterial in the eye of the law as well. And what they do is they have really early conversations. Great, you are joining us, you are thinking about joining our organization. What helps you do your best work? How do you best navigate a selection process? So the questions are proactive. They're decoupled from talk about diagnosis, and they are bound into a culture where people are reaching out rather than waiting for the person to ultimately out themselves, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I mean, one of the things that all of the work we do at Microlink is based on the social model, not the medical model, because ultimately it's about how can you perform at your best, what's going to help. Can I ask Ruhel, why did you get Nancy and Ahmed to do the research? What drove it for you?
So
just to say, I wasn't part of that research. It was
Oh, I beg your pardon, Nancy.
Yeah, no, that was
Ahmed.
definitely all Almuth. Don't want to take credit for something I didn't do.
Thank you.
I think I worked with ACAS in about 2017, but this one was all Almuth.
Yeah, we worked with Nancy previously, I believe. But this research was obviously and led by Almuth and her team at Birkbeck. But yeah, I think the reason why is because we've started, ACAS have been sort of looking into neurodiversity since around about 2016, which is when we initially did some research on neurodiversity. And what we've seen since then is an increase in the attention on neurodiversity. And as Almuth mentioned, the stats around it's at least 1 in 5. And we've seen that figure started to be reported more and more in the last few years or so. So it's a space that we thought that it's something that we definitely want to update on, with our sort of research last being done in 2016 and our research, our guidance on neurodiversity having been archived up until recently. So we decided that we wanted to explore that neurodiversity space and update that neurodiversity space, which is why we've provided some brand new research, like I say, led by Almuth, and we've also provided some brand new guidance on neurodiversity, which came out earlier this year as well. And then following that, we led a campaign on neurodiversity and reasonable adjustments. So yeah, I think it was important for us to be able to sort of update our work in this space, because it's an area that's definitely growing, that's gaining a lot more popularity. Before this call, we were talking about sort of terminology and phrases, and
Mm.
things come around as a topic gets a bit more attention. It's important that we're there to be able to sort of educate people and allow them to understand sort of the right sorts of behavior to be displaying, especially in the workplaces as well, which is a very important space for people. And I think one of the things I just wanted to also touch on as well is following on what Almuth said as well about moving into a space of being more preventative and being more proactive. I think it's important to touch on as well that a lot of the changes and the adjustments and any requests and any sort of actions and support that you might put in for neurodivergent individuals, it doesn't necessarily just have a positive impact on neurodivergent individuals. More often than not, neuroinclusion is impactful, and it benefits everybody in the workplace. So I think that's really a really important point to touch on as well. But yeah, I think for us it was a case of updating the previous work we've done in this space, and to ensure that we can still sort of promote that understanding and education that's applicable to sort of people today as well.
How do people get hold of that research?
So we've got the ACAS website, and it's got a variety of different sort of research, advice and information. I believe I did send the guidance and research and some of our campaign materials onto your colleagues. So I think that might be available
Wonderful.
for people to have a look at after this webinar. But yeah, if you go on the ACAS website, I don't remember the exact URL, but if you Google sort of ACAS neurodiversity guidance, you'll see our guidance that came out from January this year. There is also a podcast that we actually did that came out within the last week or so as well, again on neurodiversity in the workplace, which Almuth kindly featured on with us as well. And there's a smaller bit, we had a small business employer as well feature on that. But if you type in ACAS neurodiversity guidance research, a lot of our resource will come up. And I think at the moment we are still running our neurodiversity campaign. I think it runs up until the end of next week. So if you look on our social media platforms, such as LinkedIn, which is one that we're more prominent on, you'll see a lot of the resources that we've got on there. There's the infographics and sort of other materials and assets that you can engage with as well. So yeah, I'd say our website and possibly LinkedIn as well, and then any resources that you might share to your to the attendees after this.
Wonderful. That sounds like a great place to go and have a look if you haven't got something already. Nancy, adjustments to the recruitment process, talking about making it inclusive to start off with. So we're not doing the preventative, we're actually meeting them more than halfway, sorry, that sounded rude, but meeting all the candidates more than halfway. What kind of things should a company be looking at building into the processes or taking out of them?
Well, to be honest, occupational psychology has known this for decades, and I'm sure Ahmed will agree with me that the most predictive way to recruit successfully is to match the recruitment tasks to the job that you're hiring people for. So there is still a tendency for employers to rely on ye olde interview plus CV plus references. And actually, they're not very predictive of whether someone will do well in the job, particularly if the interview is unstructured, whereas work sample testing is a much more accurate way to hire people for the job. And to give you some examples of that, so in Genius Within, for example, in my company, which is over 60% neurodivergent and or disabled, and our leadership team is 75% neurodivergent, when we're hiring for our finance team, we don't interview. We send them a spreadsheet full of holes and, a set of wonky management accounts and ask them to interpret the data. And if they come back with a reasonable interpretation, we don't mind if that's on the phone or in writing or in person or over a video call. It doesn't really matter because the method of communication isn't relevant to the job. Conversely, when we're hiring coaches, you bet your bottom dollar we interview them, because that's the job. It's building rapport over, with people you haven't met quite quickly. But what we do with interviews is we give out interview questions in advance. Now, we used to only do this if people asked, and we just started doing it for everybody to create that playing field. And what we found is we just started having much higher quality interviews, because what we were measuring is people's considered thoughts rather than how anxious they were and how able they were to, how capable they were of speaking with no preparation, which actually isn't particularly typical, for a job.
It rarely happens. It rarely happens.
If you're coaching, yes, you need to be able to respond to your client, and they might say something unexpected, but you are pretty prepared in terms of what you're doing. And just one more example there. I did a piece of work for the Civil Nuclear Defence Force. It's a police force that protect our nuclear installations. They wanted to know if they had to give extra time to their candidates for one of their work sample tests. And I said, well, what's the test? And they said, we're giving them a scenario of a crisis that's unfolding, and their job is to appraise the scenario and call for backup. And we don't want to give extra time because it's actually critical that they do this quickly. It's a really vital part of the job. And I thought, well, actually, that's quite true. You want people to very quickly know, do I need to call for armed police? Do I need to call for an ambulance? Do I need to call for paramedics or fire engines? So I said to them, how are you giving the scenario? And they said, well, it's written on 2 pages of A4. And I said, well, then you're measuring how quickly they read, not how quickly they respond to a crisis. So yes, you do have to give them extra time, because what you're measuring isn't an example of what they will be doing on the job. And so they said, well, how about if we created a VR headset and we had a video of a scenario where there was like a little fire in one corner burning and, 2 people that were clearly injured over there. What if we did it like that? I said, well, if you did it like that, then absolutely. Now you don't have to give extra time, because what you're measuring is how quickly they respond to visual spatial information in context, which is a completely different part of the brain to reading. So that's what I think employers need to do. Employers need to get more inventive about how we do work sample testing, more creative about the sort of tasks that they set people. And when you do that, you have to give fewer adjustments and accommodations, and you get this will benefit everybody. But honestly, Tracy, occupational psychologists have been saying this for as long as I've been familiar with the occupational.
So why hasn't it stuck?
Oh, well, this is the trouble with occupational psychology. We're like Cassandras. We keep telling people things and nobody. The other thing is that, performance-related pay only motivates a very few number of people, particularly the kind of people that work in investment banking. And for everybody else, it's not a good motivator. And yet we still have performance-related pay across a lot of sectors. So,
I mean, what you're saying, I think is absolutely spot on. And I was very fortunate to revalidate your disability confident leadership last year, which was a great submission. The video job descriptions I loved.
Yes.
So you actually had line managers talking on video. So it's lots of different ways to communicate and connect with people, which I think is great. But what do you do culturally, Almuth, if you've got a big Fortune 500 company that, because of the advent of AI, people can now easily apply on LinkedIn? How do you manage the sheer weight of people coming through for bulk recruitment? I mean, you've got the ideal of what you're running with Genius Within, and it's great. And doing it in small pockets sounds doable. But when you suddenly think culturally about investing the time and the effort that it would take to change that, where's the ROI on that? How do you do it? And that's probably to you as well, Nancy, because both of you, your culture, your return on investment. What do you think?
I'm not a recruiter, Tracy. I genuinely am not a recruitment professional. I'm an academic, and I research inclusion and well-being. I can only emphasize again what Nancy has said, that the secret is to match any selection procedure to the job. So for instance, if you would be recruiting a senior sales executive, right, who's got some really tough accounts to manage, I don't think it would be a good idea to give them the interview questions in advance, because during the interview, you might actually want to put them on the spot and see under pressure, how do they respond to those situations, because that's exactly what they need to do in their job. There has been an awful lot of talk about AI being the solution
Yeah.
to everything.
Yeah.
I examined a PhD on that a while ago. So it was a candidate, and sadly it's never been published. They scrutinized selection data using a bit like the scenario that Nancy was describing earlier, about the different organizational contexts. And his analysis showed it had no reliability, no validity. It wasn't actually measuring anything. We think what it was measuring was whether or not people were good at playing computer games.
Oh, wow.
Rather than prediction.
Yeah,
what they
yeah.
did at the
So the
job.
gamification of stuff isn't necessarily the
Exactly.
solution going forward.
Absolutely. So
And oops, sorry.
you know,
I
the
thought you were done,
solution
Noel,
is
you
to
go.
be really, really clear in any role that you're recruiting for. What are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that actually you need in that job? And one of the things that I don't think we do terribly well here in the UK is to think we need to get away from, you have to be good at everything for every single job, right? So
Yeah.
the person who Nancy is recruiting for her finance and accounts team, do they really, need to be an orator, a people leader, right?
Yeah.
No, they need to scrutinize their spreadsheets, and they need to
Yeah.
make sure that genius within is on a sound financial footing. But actually, when you look across particularly very large organizations here in the UK, that's what we're doing. We're recruiting generalists because we've got those competency-based frameworks, and then you have to be good at everything. What we need to move towards is actually recognizing that human talent differs and making sure that we actually recruit a whole range of talents, because when you look at all the research on team effectiveness, and let's face it, a lot of us work in teams and groups.
Yeah.
The last thing you want is a team where everybody is like each other, because then no one will do the unpopular jobs, but also people don't stimulate each other. There is no divergence of thinking. So we really need to emphasize that again, that cognitive diversity, behavioral diversity is good for organizations, because also that's the kind of thing you can't ever replicate with AI. At least not yet.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I don't know if you've all heard the expression white van man. I'm looking at you. Have you heard the expression white van man? It was sort of coined in the 80s. It was very typically a kind of gentleman from a certain area of North London, and he would behave in a certain way. It was like a cookie cutter. And British Gas back in the day, how they did recruitment was they thought they would save a lot of money by actually getting all of their servicemen to go and recommend their mates and their friends from down the pub to come and join British Gas, obviously with the right skills, and they'd pay them a referral fee. And what happened was British Gas, over a period of time, found they had everybody was a man of a certain age, a certain stature, based in a certain part of the country, that spoke a certain way. And they had that there was no difference of opinion. They all thought the same. They all supported Chelsea. And it was crazy because they had to completely break that. But I think what's coming through really clearly is the conscious thought to what you need to do to change the culture of recruitment within an organization, because people are still effectively reaching into that filing cabinet behind them, pulling out that dusty old job description and sticking it on LinkedIn, and being quite lazy around how they manage that. I don't know whether you would agree with that, Nancy, because the return on investment is quite clear, isn't it?
I think one of the things we need to remember is that organizations spend an absolute fortune on recruitment. So the return on investment isn't really the question. If I think about the money spent on psychometric testing, for example, cognitive ability tests, situational judgment tests, and some of these have a really low correlation with whether or not those people turn out to be good at the jobs, so I think it's more of a psychological shift that people need to make. My business partner and colleague, Jackie Wallace, who's the CEO of our business, says something which I think is quite insightful. She says, no one ever loses their job for doing what we've always done. So, if you've got a recruitment system that you've always used, no one is going to lose their job if they're in charge of that recruitment system for carrying on using that recruitment system. But if you try something different and you make a mistake, people feel vulnerable. And, in some organizations that would that would create a problem for you. So I think we just have to break out of the mold, and what we need is some good research. We need some case studies. We need the businesses who are prepared to break out of that mold and want to do a better job of recruitment coming forward, so that we can work with them, so that we can research that, so that we can tell stories about it, and kind of make the case that this is a risk worth taking. And you know, people, you can pilot this stuff in quite small pockets and go, let's try this. Instead of doing the usual battery of cognitive ability testing and personality testing that we normally do, let's try this work sample test instead and see what happens. So, you know, I think that's really the barrier. I don't think it's cost. I think it's change. The barrier is change.
I wonder if there's anyone brave enough in the audience currently who's going to stick their hand up and go, hey, Nancy, hey, Microlink, let's give this a go. Let's see what we can achieve. Because I think that would be a really exciting thing to see living, wouldn't it? So I don't know whether anyone's feeling brave. We'll keep an eye on the chat and see. Ruhel, can you give me some idea of adjustments that you found in your research that are really useful?
Well, with the adjustments, one thing I should highlight though is that although there may be people that have the same types of neurodivergence, everybody is different. So what may work for one person doesn't necessarily work
Spot on.
for another.
Really important point.
So yeah, there might be sort of standardized examples of adjustments that can be helpful for the majority of people. For example, not being able to travel, not having to travel during peak times, sort of having a quiet space that you can work in, providing people with sort of noise cancelling headphones or fidget toys. Those kind of things can be helpful for a variety of people. But I think for us, the key point to narrow down is that adjustments, a reasonable adjustment is exactly that. It's a reasonable adjustment for the person to be able to work and sort of help reduce or remove an advantage, a disadvantage that they may be facing whilst they're at work. So I think while there is those kind of standardized reasonable adjustments that Almuth made recommendations for in the research, it is more a case of speak to the individual, see what may work for them, and go from there. And also, if there is an adjustment that doesn't necessarily work, well, let's go back to the drawing board, have that continued conversation with your report or with your manager, and let's try something else, and go from there.
How important is it to keep a record of what's going on then, Ruhel?
So I think keeping the record, again, you need to sort of reach a balance where some individuals might feel like they don't prefer having to sort of have a written record of any sort of adjustments or conversations that they might have. Whereas on the flip side, it can sometimes be quite helpful. I think one of the things that sort of comes out to me quite a bit is we did some research on disability discrimination and employment tribunal claims last year with ACAS. And one of the reasons for conflict was during sort of management change, where employees were sort of having conflict with new managers, where they had sort of previous adjustments in place, but their new management or sort of new senior leadership weren't aware of those adjustment requests, or they didn't know how to action them. So I think in those kind of scenarios, having some kind of record or some kind of conversation, something sort of a record of the conversations that you have can be helpful. I think one of the useful tools that comes to mind is a wellness action passport as well. I think you can easily access many of those online. I think they're quite helpful in terms of sort of allowing people to, first of all, start a conversation around sort of support and reasonable adjustments and help that they might need, but also keeping a record of that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really interesting. Nancy, you mentioned about the return on investment. It's absolutely a no-brainer. We are already looking at a quarter of your workforce and your candidates coming through as being neurodiverse, being neurodivergent, whichever phrase we choose to go with. What are the key things that when somebody comes on board, we need to be doing to make sure the investment in recruitment works for both them and for the employer?
Ooh, onboarding. Onboarding is not easy.
It's not
It's
easy, but
really not
people
easy.
treat it
Yeah.
as a separate, and it's often a separate team. Aside from recruitment, aside from HR, there seems to be a disconnect for me within a lot of companies.
I mean, it's difficult to suggest a one-size-fits-all approach
Yeah,
that will work for everybody. And that's, you know, I think that's the message that's coming through around all adjustments, is that they have to be tailored to an individual need. But I think where we're starting to get to is actually we've focused our attention on the wrong place for the problem. So we're focusing our attention on neurodivergent people might find it harder to onboard. So what do we need to do for them? And I think the problem is managers find it hard to onboard people. How do we
yeah,
support managers
yeah.
to do onboarding? Because neurodivergence isn't the only thing that would make somebody have trouble onboarding. It might be that that person has PTSD. It might be that that person has a physical disability. It might be that that person is very shy. It might be that they have English as a second language and they're not quite understanding everything and the instructions as easily. There are lots of reasons why people might struggle with onboarding, and neurodivergence is only one of them. So the source of the problem here isn't neurodivergence and accommodations. The source of the problem here is manager competence and the lack of training that we give managers in how to onboard people and how to manage performance. That's where the problem is.
And I hear that a lot. We get a lot of clients will phone us up at Microlink saying, we've got to like almost the end of the road with this particular troublesome individual. I mean, honestly, neurodiverse people tend to be obviously the most arsey, awkward individuals in the world, because you're asking for something to be done differently. And the kind of narrative that we hear is really quite sad, because it's not, they're saying, well, we've done everything we can to make adjustments. How much further can we take it? And it almost feels like, well, you haven't tried and tested something
And
that
also,
works.
you know, sometimes, so I think often the neurodivergent people are the canary in the coal mine. So, you know, the things
That's a
that
really good
neurodivergent
expression.
people
Yeah.
are prepared to vocalize and say, I'm not quite sure what this means, is something that someone else might just assume they know what is meant and then go off and do it and get it wrong. So, you know, if we problematize the neurodivergent individual, we're not
Yeah.
learning from what they're telling us that might be related to other important
That's a really important
processes.
point.
So yeah, so I think it's always worth listening to why that neurodivergent person is struggling, but the conversation being dominated by these are my needs and this is what this is therefore what I have to have. These are my needs and this is therefore what I have to have. That's where the conversation is going wrong, because it feels like a race to a race to the resources, you know, a
It's
zero-sum
combative as well.
game where
Yeah.
it is combative. It's combative and adversarial, and really the question is, how do we support all our employees to work at their best, and how do we expand the range of employees that can be welcome and thriving in this workplace? What have we learned from the accommodations and adjustments we've made in the last couple of years that we should take forward as standard occupational practice, so that people don't have to get into difficulty, don't have to feel frustrated, and don't have to get into these kind of, you know, zero-sum games with their employer.
And they don't necessarily then have to tell you, do they? Because you've created the environment where they're going to thrive. They've perhaps got a self-service that they can go and organize if they need a different piece of mind mapping software. You can look at, as a company, to save some costs as well. If you're looking at that enterprise licensing for software, it's much, much cheaper than individual licensing.
Precisely.
It's easier to manage.
Yeah, and you'll blend it in better with your systems if you're applying it across, or because it's not just neurodivergent people who use that stuff. It's also people with long COVID, perimenopause, multiple sclerosis, and in fact a lot of the illnesses that become chronic in middle and older age. And given that we have an aging workforce, we're going to have to adapt this stuff anyway. So why don't we just do it? And then fewer people need to put their hand up and ask for help, which is stigmatizing, and therefore we know that people don't put their hand up and ask for help until they're in crisis. And
Yeah.
that's why it's become adversarial, because by the time they get there, they're in crisis. And if they're in crisis, so is their manager, and so possibly are several of their teams. And that's
Yeah.
when the relationships have gone. And that's why they're coming to you, Tracy, and saying mean things
Yeah.
about their employees, because the relationships have broken down.
Yes.
And that's why the prevention method is preferred,
Yeah.
because once you've lost the relationships, it's really hard to get it back. Tracy, I don't know if you've noticed, but Almuth's very patiently had her hand up for the last few minutes.
Oh, I didn't. I'm so sorry,
Yeah.
Almuth.
That's
Thank you for putting your hand up. So sorry I didn't catch it then. Please.
Well, I just didn't want to interrupt the flow, which was so beautiful, but I also wanted to be respectful to our audience, because there are quite a few very poignant questions in the
Well,
chat.
there are some interesting questions, so
And I
thank you
wanted,
for pointing that out.
and I wanted to pick up a couple of them, if that's okay, because it links
Please,
to what
please.
Nancy was speaking about. One of them was around, we are having an increased number of employees who are being diagnosed quite late in life, and they don't know, in a sense, what adjustments might help them. The other question was around, you're working with somebody, you notice that they are behaving and working in a very different way. Would you ever raise the conversations around potential neurodivergence? So the answer to both of those questions is actually, we need to re-educate ourselves in having really good, clear, honest conversations in the workplace.
Yeah.
That is helpful for any management as a baseline, and that is particularly important when you've got a lot of neurodivergent workers. So in order to support people who've been diagnosed later in life, and you were seeing that it's in our own research, because children are now more likely, at least in some areas, to be diagnosed earlier. The children look at the diagnostic report and think, gee whiz, that looks a bit like me. So off they go, and then they have their 2-3 year wait list, and then they get their diagnosis. So this is a thing. So let's move towards sharing good practice in organizations, and a lot of adjustments that are really helpful, such as having really unambiguous, clear conversations, making sure that people are welcome to turn off their camera in team meetings if they find it intrusive. They do not cost anybody anything, but you need to raise awareness. This is a really good and helpful thing for people, and should be destigmatized. Have a central budget for low-cost adjustments, because when it comes out of the line manager's budget, they get a bit like, ooh, I don't know, might this reflect badly on me? No, it won't, because it's a performance conversation. Why wouldn't you give somebody, a pair of noise cancelling headphones for £100 if that makes them 30% more effective? So it's about shifting the conversation to good performance, having those conversation skills. And when you notice that a colleague is working differently and they're struggling with it, give them feedback and say, look, Tracy, I have observed, right, over the last 3 weeks, I've noticed you come into meetings late. I've noticed that you've become quieter and quieter. Should the two of us go for a cup of tea, right? Or for a virtual cup of tea, and just have a human conversation? And actually, that is something that all of us can do. We are so shy here in the UK about having performance conversations. As a native German, we tend to be a bit more direct. I continuously got on, put that in the forward for Nancy's book. It's always, oh, Almuth, you can't say that. It's too bad. But why can't we say it? Why can't we say, do you know what? That wasn't our finest job. It wasn't our finest hour, because this and this and this happened. This is what we need to learn. This is how we're going to do it differently next time. If you can do that openly, that is such an important baseline for psychological safety.
Absolutely agree, and thank you so much for that, because I think part of one of the questions that we've got on here is, do you go to a colleague who is, you suspect, neurodiverse? Do you open that conversation up with them? And you're saying, yes, do, in a human way, relate to individuals as human beings. I mean, to go up to somebody and say, oh, you're autistic, is probably not the best approach. There are softer ways of doing these things. And we tend to, again, at my clinic, we tend to go from a basis of, what are you struggling with? It doesn't really matter what's causing that. I mean, one of the effects of the menopause is having autism-like characteristics when you're going through it. Brain fog, struggling with getting work done, bits and pieces that are similar. but I wouldn't expect anybody to point a finger at me and say, Tracy, are you? I'd expect somebody to say, oh, are you struggling with anything currently? Can we recommend some software, or do you need some training, or do you just need a cup of coffee on a Friday so you can download what's going on? But it has to be that human interaction, doesn't it? So we've got one of the questions we've got here from Sue Nicholas. I'm trying to read with my glasses. I think I should have a pair of yours, Almuth. I've put mine down somewhere. We've got neurodivergent employees, office space, whom we support as well as we possibly can. However, some do not want their condition disclosed. So how do you manage reasonable adjustments with regards to explaining to the rest of the team that someone is being treated more favourably, interesting phrase, than everyone else? I mean, Nancy, can you comment on that?
Yes, I can. I mean, this is the most common issue that people have, actually, is, why is this person getting this and why is that person not getting that? And that's why I think we need to bring the conversation away from adjustments as help, and towards adjustments as ways to improve performance and productivity. So, here's two different conversations. Conversation one is when I wear noise cancelling headphones, I get through my emails in an hour. So I'd really like to do that at least 3 times a week so that I can get through my workload. That's one conversation. Another conversation is I have dyslexia and dyspraxia. I find it really hard to read my emails, and I find it almost impossible to do it in the office. I'm really finding it difficult to concentrate. I need something to help me block out the background noise. So I need you to get me some noise cancelling headphones. They are two very different conversations, and they're framed in very different ways. So I think, which manager here wouldn't spend 50 quid on some headphones if they could get a 50% productivity improvement out of their team? Do you know?
I think some of the challenges, though, that some of the headsets, I mean, I've seen some that people use then for gaming that can be £300-400,
They
and it's
can,
not
yeah.
really the client's responsibility or the employer's responsibility to provide you with gaming headphones. I would
No, it's
suggest.
not. No, it's not. And Leonora's saying you'd be surprised, and I wouldn't be surprised. But this is the conversation that I think all employers need to start having, is that people aren't asking for these things because they're favors. People are asking for these things because they want to do their jobs properly. People want to come to work and do a good job. We need to be ambitious for neurodivergent people. We need it. When people come to Genius Within for coaching, 25% of them are promoted within a year. That's what we need to be focusing on. How do we get people to fulfill their potential, to do their best work? And again, I'm sorry, but it comes back to management skill, doesn't it? What you said as you led into this question, Tracy, is it's about those one-to-one conversations. It's about the interaction. Now, if you've got a floor with 20 people on it and 50% of them need noise cancelling headphones, do you know what? Actually, your business case is make the office less sound sensitive.
But that's a good point, because the built environment is one of the kind of the last adjustments that we see being made. And I mean, I recently went into a big professional services company, and I looked at a couple of their floors, and I was walking around half the time going, oh my God, the lights are really bright, and this is for me. And I wanted to have my headphones on, just walking around their office. So there's a whole piece around the physical environment as well.
And there's some really good British Standards Institute guidance on the built environment and how to make it neuroinclusive, that I think, maybe you could send that out in your resources, because there's really good guidance on that. Alison Can is a built environment specialist nurse. I love that job. That sounds great.
It does sound good.
More of you, Alison.
Can we just ask, we got a question here from somebody who Ruhel wanted to ask about access to work. I don't know if you know about this, but I just wanted to see what your knowledge base is from ACAS point of view. If somebody applies for an access to work grant and they don't get enough to support them, where do they go? What happens?
So yeah, I'm not necessarily an expert on
Okay, no, that's fine.
But yeah, I know that they can provide some form of support. I think it comes down to the point that when it comes to adjustments and requests for support and workplace adjustments at work, that is the employer's obligation, and it is down to the employer to provide to make those provisions. Access to work don't provide reasonable adjustments, but yeah, I do understand that they do provide some form of grants and other forms of support as well. But yeah, I'm not an expert on access to work, unfortunately.
They
I mean,
also,
sorry,
also
Nancy.
the other thing to remember is that adjustments, the only way you can decide whether an adjustment was reasonable or not is in a court of law.
Yes.
So only a court of law can pronounce whether the adjustment was reasonable.
You can
And
go back to access to work. You can argue the toss. It's not the easiest thing to do. I mean, they do an amazing job with very limited resources for far too many individuals going through the process. They want to put another 100,000 people through the process. I don't know how it's going to cope with that. But there's a few questions in here about access to work. It's worthwhile noting that in the first 6 weeks of somebody taking the job from you and starting, all the adjustments and the assessments are made for free. They're paid for by the government. So that's within the first 6 weeks. There's a very, very important box, top left-hand corner, that you have to tick as somebody applying for access to work, whereby you say, I have a job, and they put you to the front of the queue. I've seen somebody processed and done.
Do you know, I'm an ADHDer. I have a
Mm,
PhD that I
mm.
acquired whilst growing a business and raising twin sons.
Wow.
I cannot manage access to work forms.
Wow.
I can't do it. So I think one of the things there's a consultation going on about
Mm,
access to work right now, and I think people
yeah,
should be
yeah,
contributing to that consultation about the accessibility of the process. Someone's put in the chat that the waiting time is 31 weeks. I hear you, Tracy,
yeah,
that there's a
yeah,
box in the corner,
yeah.
but the ability of neurodivergent people to find that
That's
box and to tick
fascinating.
it is not necessarily,
Yeah.
depending on their neurotype, form filling can be the Achilles heel of a neurodivergent person, particularly a dyslexic or an ADHD or a dyspraxic person. So I think, relying on access to work is older hat. Employers need to start stepping up. This isn't about, can we get the government to give us a handout so that we can keep employing this person. Employers need to realize that if they have employed someone, they have invested some money already in that process. It is going to be very expensive for that person to leave and get another. You have to bring another person in. You have to spend money on the recruitment. You have to spend money on the onboarding. This is a waste of resources for the want of a £300 headset. You are absolutely underspending in terms of what you would do to replace that person. And I think our strong message has to be to employers that adjustments are about performance. They're about productivity. They're about helping people to work at their best. They're about talent. They're about progression. And there are ways to do this that are less resource intensive than the way people are doing it at the moment. We're doing it all at the moment via the medical model. We wait for diagnosis and disclosure, and then we put in place another assessment or some more barriers, and then eventually we end up giving the kind of advice that Almuth was describing earlier, which is things that are free and easy to put in place. So I think, we need to flip that model. And employers need to take control of the easy to deliver stuff themselves, and they need to start rolling that out with, the next line of response being technology specialists and coaches and training courses, and then we might progress to assessments. So one thing that we've done recently at Genius Within, with some investment money from the Big Issue Social Impact Fund, is we've designed a psychometric assessment called the Genius Finder, which profiles your work tasks, what you find easy at work and what you find hard at work, gives you a report of your strengths and a report of where your challenges are, and it recommends for you, a personalised selection of 430 workplace performance strategies that will make your life easier, depending on what kind of cognitive process you're finding challenging. And what we're finding is that when people so we work with some occupational health companies, and when the occupational health advisors sit and go through that process with their clients, they reduce the number of people who need any more adjustments by 50%. So a good case manager on the phone with a Genius Finder assessment reduces the number of people that need more stuff by 50%. So that's where we need to, we've got, it's a dual thing. So we need to push up the number of people that are getting some sort of support, but we need to bring down the cost of that initial support. And at the moment, we're wasting all our money on assessments when we could be spending our money wisely on cheap to implement and simple to apply adjustments. So that's what we're trying to do, is switch that balance at the moment.
Interesting to see. Thank you. And I have to say, I mean, Genius Within guys are amazing. We love partnering with you. Fantastic organisation. Ruhel, what's the next steps for ACAS when this period of neurodivergent stuff finishes next week? What's the next project?
So we're currently still working through our business strategy for 2025 onwards. But I think for us, especially within the neurodiversity space, is to still be engaged within this space. I know sort of there is various awareness days and events still coming up for the rest of the year. I know that it's World Autism Day next week as well. So it's very much a plan for ACAS to still be involved in the neurodiversity space. I think for us as well, it's we've got certain events and webinars booked as well. I think for us, speaking and being involved in the neurodiversity space is still very much on the agenda. And I think, like I mentioned, the guidance that we brought out earlier this year, I think later this year we will be looking to review that as well and updating that if need be. I think we mentioned before the webinar started that the area and topic of neurodiversity is constantly evolving, and it's one of those areas where things evolve quite fast. So it's important that we do sort of remain in this space and stay on top of it. And any advice and guidance that we put out is regularly reviewed and stayed on top of as well. So we definitely look to be involved in the neurodiversity space. But as we move forward from 2025 up until about 2030, we're looking to review sort of which other areas of equality, diversity, and inclusion that ACAS should be involved in, which other areas that should be a priority, and we can go from there and update sort of as we go along. But yeah, in the neurodiversity space, we do definitely look to continuously sort of review any advice and best practice that we do put out there.
Yeah, wonderful. That is future planning. 2030.
Yeah,
It's like, crikey.
we
Love
are
that.
currently sort of working through our business strategy, so we can sort of plan out what we need to do and which areas we do need to prioritize.
Thank you. We've got a question from Shireen, I think the lady's name is, about a reasonable adjustment passport. And they've got colleagues with ND, specifically ADHD and autism, that are struggling to complete and feel overwhelmed, which is something you talked about earlier, Ahmed, and yourself, Nancy, with filling in forms. And what we're trying to get to further to what you were saying, Nancy, as well, when Microlink are advising companies on what to do on a corporate basis, it's around how do you make it as business as usual? How do you look at the top 5 bits of assistive technology and make sure your IT team can install them? So, your mind mapping software, whether it's MindView or Mind Manager or any one of the other types of mapping software there are, look at things like Dragon, look at how you can get enterprise licenses to bring the cost down and make it more manageable for your IT teams, but that people can then just self-serve themselves. So we go away from that having to get the assessment, having to get the diagnosis, having to get the permission of a line manager to get an adjustment. You just go online to your welfare hub in a business and say, great, let me try this. Let me see if this works for me. We also do things like grab bags. So some companies have accessibility centers, and we have neurodiverse grab bags, which include everything from branded weighted t-shirts for a particular company. So you don't have to say to anyone you're feeling overwhelmed. You could just put your t-shirt on and feel more comfortable and grounded, literally grounded. Branded fidget tools, looking at things like lily lamps or weighted blankets if you've got corporate travel involved in your business. So there's lots of way of making it not so upfront and central, but you do have to have that conversation if people want more specialized, personalized adjustments, and you should be recording it because you need to measure the efficacy of what you are doing differently. Because if it's not removing the barriers for that colleague, it's no good saying, well, we did the first round of it and it didn't work, it didn't stick. Therefore, you need to keep looking at what you can do and exploring all the different options. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that in terms of adjustments, Nancy?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, Tracy? I'm
In
answering questions
terms,
in the
I'm
chat.
so sorry. It's difficult to do both at once. I'm not very
Yeah.
good at doing that. Thank you, though. So in terms of making reasonable adjustments, the question that keeps coming up is, are they doing enough? Are they touching the points? Are they able to get people to tell them that they need the adjustments? And then again, it's that simple thing of, are they being treated more favorably? Which is quite an interesting concept in itself. I mean, if you've got a blind person, just giving them a guide dog mean that you're being more favorable to them?
Greg has just made a really good point in the Q&A, actually, which is that that's the job. That's the point of the Equality Act, is that you give disabled people an advantage to compensate for the disadvantage that they bring into their role. So it is actually the legal requirement of adjustments is to provide additional support services to disabled people.
You're just bringing them up to the same level, really.
Totally,
you're
totally. So I think that's I really like that point, Greg, and I think it's a fair point, and I think the court cases that have been would agree with you. The case law would definitely support that. But you know, just in general, if the only conversation we have about neurodivergence in the workplace is about adjustments, it just makes everybody feel tired and drained. The conversation has to change. The lesson of the neurodiversity movement wasn't that we need to help more people. The lesson of the neurodiversity movement was that people are naturally cognitively diverse. And at the moment, we are limiting the amount of creativity and productivity in our workforce because we are wedded to conventions that no longer apply. So, you know, it used to be absolutely essential to have a typing pool in an office where they were next to ledgers. That was essential because all the ledgers were hard copies and they had to be next to them. That it's not essential anymore. Everybody is able to do remote access. You know, it used to be essential that people had to read and write. It's not essential anymore. We all have these things that read and write for us. You know, these
absolutely.
phones. So the world is changing. The world is changing faster than the conventions of the workplace. What neurodiversity does is it tells you where to change your workplace so that you can keep up with the future. The future is coming whether we like it or not. Technology has already arrived. It has fundamentally changed the way we think, the way we work, the way we communicate. And what neurodivergent inclusive behaviors look like is simply making the world of work more attuned to the full range of human diversity.
Love that.
That's the conversation. Not what do I need to provide? What do I need to do that I'm not already doing? You know, and that's one of that's the other reason why you know, we want the Genius Finder to be the first pass at this, because the idea with the Genius Finder is that everybody gets engaged in thinking, how do I work at my best? What can I do myself? What kind of tips and strategies and ways of working? How do I change my way of working so that it suits my brain style? And making people engaged in their own thought processes so that they can do that themselves, I think is step one. And making sure that they're in an environment where people are interested in that, where you can share your spiky profile result with your manager and go, oh, isn't it interesting? I find this task really easy, but you find that really hard. I wonder what could we share? How could we do that? That's the conversations that everybody needs to be having at work. And if we make the neurodiversity conversation more like that, people will stop getting grumpy about who's got what.
Let's hope. I'm very conscious of time. We've got a couple of minutes. I wanted to come to Ruhel and then Almuth to see if there's any last thoughts. Any questions that haven't been answered? I'm very conscious that there were a lot of questions. I will go through and answer them after the session.
If there are any questions left on, we can go through them later and add it to the resource page. So don't worry about that.
Thank you, Asade. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I haven't been looking at the chat just because it's been moving too fast for me.
Don't worry.
No, but I think one of the things that I just did want to touch on, Nancy and Almuth have both touched on throughout the webinar as well, is the importance and pinpointing line managers as well. Line managers are, I think that's probably
They're
one of the
key.
points that I'd like to finish on, just because they're potentially involved from the moment that people recruit on board and all the way throughout the course of their employment. They're often the first port of call. They're the ones dealing with any sort of request for support, any disclosure conversations, and even sort of performance or capability and misconduct conversations as well. They're a really important part of a neurodivergent individual or any employee's part of the employment journey. So it's essential that line managers are trained to be able to sort of manage conversations correctly, help people start their new role, support them as they enter the workplace, and even if it's you deal with a wide range of people that are school leavers moving into employment, people that have been in employment for a long time, people that have had later diagnosis, a diagnosis later in life. So I think line managers are a really important part of everybody's employment journey, and an area that we should focus on.
Thank you, Ruhel. And Almuth, last word with you.
Last word. I love having the last word. Do you know what we haven't talked about at all yet is well-being, and we need to put well-being at the center of everything we do. Well-being is not a maybe outcome, right? It's a necessary premise for people doing good work. And actually reviewing everything that you do through a neuroinclusive lens will lead you to the well-being issue. And let's face it, look at the mental health statistics, right? In 2-3 years, we are all going to be working with a workforce that on average is going to be mentally less well in themselves. One of the concepts that we've put forward in our about to be published papers is we think that organizations need to become proactive carers, right? So it's going beyond the business case. It's about recognizing actually your talent might potentially be vulnerable, because this is also part of the world that we live in. And reviewing everything that you do through a neuro-inclusive lens will make you better at managing that well-being bit.
What a fantastic final words. Thank you so much. Thank you to Ruhel and to Nancy and to Almuth. Really, really appreciate your time. And of course, for you guys joining. Resources are coming out. We're out of time. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Tracy. Bye.
Bye-bye.